Mohamed El-Erian is here, Chief Economic Advisor to Allianz, President of Queen's College at Cambridge University, and a Fed, are you a whisperer? What are you?
Observer.
A Fed observer. Did you think it was dovish, more dovish than you were expecting yesterday?
Oh, absolutely. And in two ways. One is a signal that they're willing to tolerate higher inflation for longer. And second, something that is flying below the radar screen is what Chair Powell said about QT, said about the balance sheet, saying that he's willing to slow down the journey to a lower balance sheet. I think that twin patience means that we may well look back on this week as the week in which central banks stepped away from a very strict inflation target to a much broader concept of an inflation target.
And this has, in your view, nothing to do with the election?
So I would like to believe the Fed in saying that it is apolitical.
You would like to believe? Do you believe?
Look, I have no other reason to believe otherwise.
Well, it was weirdly dovish, and I keep bringing up that suddenly it seems like the asymmetric risk is now of a recession after we've had two really hot inflation numbers.
So I was with you when you asked me what does the outlook look like. I told you 55% soft landing, 30% recession, 15% something better than that.
Oh, yeah, I remember.
And I think that they realize two things. I think they realize that the economy is weakening, but they've also realized, or I hope they're going to realize, that we are living in a world in which the supply side is the problem, and that we need to tolerate slightly higher inflation if we don't want to sacrifice the economy. And I think that's the right thing.
Supply side is the problem because why? Is it because governments are still spending so much? The United States government is still spending so much money? I mean, it's weird to have fiscal doing one thing, monetary doing the other thing.
Correct. And we should be doing more to enhance the supply side. It is the problem, first, because of geopolitics. We are redesigning supply chains. Second, companies are emphasizing resilience as much as efficiency. So they are embarking on a more costly supply chain for good reasons. Third, the labor market is not as flexible as we'd like it to be. And then we're looking at a very uncertain energy transition. You put all that together and supply will not be flexible enough, and the Fed will have a choice. Either it accepts slightly higher inflation or it unnecessarily tips the economy into recession.
What's to say that the inflation remains slightly higher and doesn't get out of control?
That's the bet. That's absolutely the risk. But there's been no evidence so far of de-anchoring inflation expectations. And markets are behaving in this way. On the inflation side, look at gold, look at equities, but then look at treasuries, and you get no indication of inflation expectations.
Like cross currents. But we said that. There's a lot of animal spirits for the Fed to be worrying about a recession. And you said the economy is weakening. Well, I've seen two hot inflation numbers, 2 straight months. I've seen that. I haven't.
Three, because PPI as well.
So 3 straight, but now they're saying it's transitory again. I haven't seen, where's the weakness in the economy you're talking about?
Oh, you're seeing it in manufacturing. You're starting to pick it up in other elements, in the quits rate.
Then there's a lag, and it's going to it will continue to slow.
It will continue to slow, and they're trying to make that slowing as orderly as possible. It is fascinating to me that when Chair Powell was asked about financial conditions, everybody that looks at broader financial conditions says, gosh, they are so loose. He dismissed that completely. He's looking at a very, very narrow, and in fact, Roger Ferguson repeated it today when he said we are in restrictive territory because they're looking just at the policy rate relative to other indicators, not at the holistic financial conditions.
Roger said that, but then he said, no, and people can argue about how restrictive, which makes me think that that's a judgment. Are you sure we're in restrictive territory right now, given the economic backdrop?
We are more likely to be in restrictive than not restrictive.
Okay.
But look elsewhere as well. The Bank of Japan surprised on the dovish side. The Swiss National Bank today surprised on the dovish side. You're starting to get a signal from central banks that I believe we're going to look back at this moment.
They all got elections coming up? Let me ask you, did you see what we're spending next year?
A lot of money.
$7 trillion. So Obama, first time ever, we went over $4 trillion. Then COVID, pandemic, we need money. An extra $2 trillion got us to 6.9 or whatever. COVID's gone, basically. I mean, I still see Why are people still wearing masks? I don't know, maybe they got the reason. But why are we at $7 trillion? Why $7 trillion next year? Why?
Because whether it's the U.S. or elsewhere, we ratchet. We
never go back from the crisis levels?
We don't. That's really
a bad...
Well, neither does the Fed's balance sheet.
Yeah, the UK is the same thing. It is sad, and at some point we're going to pay for this. We will pay for this.
We have been saying this for so long that we're going to pay for it. We're going to be talking to MacGuineas a little later about some of the issues surrounding this, too. We've been saying this for so long, decades and decades. When does it actually...
So remember the old PIMCO concept of the cleanest dirty shirt.
Yeah.
Okay, we live in a relative world. So if we misbehave and others misbehave more, we don't get punished because we've got the reserve currency, and we are the place where people outsource savings to. So as long as we remain the cleanest dirty shirt, then we're not going to be punished. If others start being cleaner than us, then this will change. But right now, we are the cleanest dirty shirt.
News from Microsoft crossing just moments ago. Our Steve Kovac is at CNBC headquarters with those headlines. Steve, over to you.
Hey there, Frank. Yeah, Microsoft right now launching its first artificial intelligence PCs. Now, these are updates to Surface computers. The Surface Pro 10 is the new one, and the Surface Laptop 6. But what makes them different, and really what is an AI PC? Well, it's a term you can expect to hear a lot this year, and here's what Microsoft says its new AI PCs can do. They have a special kind of chip inside called a neural processing unit, or NPU, that can perform AI tasks faster and more efficiently. Now, in Microsoft's case, that means Copilot, of course. That's the digital assistant that's now built into Windows 11 for business users, and Microsoft sells businesses the Copilot service for a whopping $30 per user per month. Now, with these new AI PCs, Microsoft claims Copilot is more efficient. That means better battery life, performance, and running AI tasks faster. If you've ever used Copilot or another AI chatbot, you know it can take several seconds or more for it to kind of spit out that result after you give it a command. And this is likely the first of many AI PCs we're going to see this year. And while these Surfaces use Intel chips, Qualcomm also has a new chip that's expected to appear in computers like this later this year. The bottom line, though, this is Microsoft's attempt to get more businesses to pay for Copilot, promising better performance on those devices, plus time-saving productivity gains for employees. There's some caveats here. The Wall Street Journal earlier this year said some Copilot customers who have tried it early have found problems with it. So it's actually still yet to be determined if it's worth that hefty cost Microsoft's asking for. As for these new Surface computers, they're on sale now and going to start shipping on April 9th, Frank.
All right, Microsoft shares up just about 1%, rising about 0.25% since this news crossed. Steve, stick around. We're going to get back to you. I know you have more on that Apple antitrust news. I'm going to come over to you guys here at Post 9. Carrie, saw you looking over at me when Steve was talking. AI PCs, clearly it struck a chord with you.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. All we've been hearing about is AI chips, and nobody's been making any money off of AI, really, except for NVIDIA. So it's interesting to think that Microsoft is finally coming up with something other than Copilot from which that they can boost their revenue based on everything they have in their pocket on AI. Remember, they own a big share of OpenAI's profitable arm, and they're a connector to the whole artificial intelligence world, but we haven't heard a lot more than Copilot. And using it in a PC, embedded in your PC, I think that's ingenious. We really haven't considered this aspect of it, and I thought, wow, maybe, bad on me not to have done so, but it's not just about the chip, it's the different ways we can use it. So, that's an applause to Microsoft.
Carrie, you own Microsoft. Bill, Kevin, you own it as well. I just want to bounce something off you from Gartner. It came out just a few days ago. They say Gen AI capabilities and AI processors will eventually become a standard requirement for tech vendors, but the ubiquity will make it challenging for companies to actually differentiate and make money on it. Kevin, I'm going to start with you. Again, Microsoft shares did move higher on this news, but are you concerned it's a lot of hype, but the monetization may be more difficult?
No, I think that's the reason to own Microsoft, because here's a company that, to Carrie's point, is actually monetizing the AI within their Copilot, now with these computers as well. If you look at their cloud business, up 23% last quarter, revenues in general up double digits. If you're going to be first to market and you want to monetize something, owning companies like Microsoft that make money is absolutely the way to do it. Love the stock here.
Bill?
This is just the start. I mean, the expectation was they're going to be one of the first to bring NVIDIA's technology and networking through Azure. And I think, I mean, I have a Surface right here. I love it. It's a great machine. And I think it's just the start of the monetization of what we're seeing here, moving away from NVIDIA, moving away from the chips. You're going to start to see it across the table in the tech sector and then through other sectors as well.
Josh, AI PCs get you excited?
Well, look, I think at the edge is really where the money's going to be made. The big platform companies are obviously going to be the immediate beneficiaries of increased usage of AI, followed by the data vendors, folks like Snowflake, et cetera. But when you think about the really, really big consumer-facing and/or enterprise-facing opportunity, it's probably going to be at a layer in which regular people on an everyday basis are interacting with these tools and paying subscription fees to somebody for the right to do so. So I really don't think that this is any surprise that we're starting to see announcements of this flavor. There'll be a lot more. It's really, really early still. I think what you want to focus on, though, is probably the software opportunity more than just the hardware opportunity. The hardware will be exciting first, then eventually it'll become table stakes, it'll be commoditized, everybody will have the hardware capability, and so then it becomes a game of who has the best app, who has the best consumer-facing and or employee-facing app, and what are the stickiest services that people get to a point where they can't live without. We're probably, I don't know, I'm not a technologist, maybe 6 months to 12 months away from me being able to definitively say anything. So for now, we should all just continue to monitor these developments.
Breaking news here on Apple out of the DOJ. Eamon Javers has it. Eamon?
Sarah, this is a civil antitrust lawsuit filed in the United States District Court for the District of New Jersey, and it alleges by the DOJ that Apple illegally maintains a monopoly over smartphones by selectively imposing contractual restrictions on and withholding critical access points from developers. The Department of Justice alleges Apple has broken the law, specifically Section 2 of the Sherman Antitrust Act, in 5 specific ways. One, by blocking innovative super apps. They say Apple has disrupted the growth of apps with broad functionality. The second is by suppressing mobile cloud streaming services. They say Apple blocked the development of cloud streaming apps and services that would allow consumers to enjoy what they call high-quality video games and other cloud-based applications without having to pay for expensive smartphone hardware. The third is by excluding cross-platform messaging apps. The Department of Justice says Apple has made the quality of cross-platform messaging worse, less innovative, and less secure for users so that its customers have to keep buying iPhones. The fourth is by diminishing the functionality of non-Apple smartwatches. Apple, they say, has limited the functionality of these third-party smartwatches so that users who purchase the Apple Watch face substantial out-of-pocket costs if they don't keep buying iPhones. And the fifth category here is limiting third-party digital wallets. They say Apple has prevented third-party apps from offering tap-to-pay functionality, inhibiting the creation of cross-platform third-party digital wallets, which, of course, is important in the whole paying ecosystem here. Now, the court process is expected to take months, if not years here. And guys, there's a political overlay to all of this, because if President Biden is to lose to Donald Trump in the fall, it's a Trump Department of Justice that could be in charge of handling the end game of this case, not a Biden one, depending on that election outcome. So it's not at all clear how that would play out, although some of the Trump people were involved in instigating this investigation into Apple in the first place back during the first Trump administration. So a lot of moving parts here, guys. But the Department of Justice now suing Apple on antitrust grounds. Back over to you.
Right. So they started looking into this in 2019 under the first Trump administration. And really, Eamon, it's part of a number of monopoly cases. Or David laughed at that. The original Trump administration.
Are you predicting something already?
Nope, just stating facts. Eamon, the part of the other monopoly cases I was going to bring up against other big tech companies, Amazon, Alphabet, they've all been filed as well.
Yeah, and I think if you talk to the people at the Department of Justice, what folks involved here have told me is that they view this really as about the App Store, right? You've got Google and Android apps, and you've got Apple apps, and those two vectors are really the only way for every other company to get to market here. And there's a lot of concern on antitrust grounds that that's just not enough, that if those two companies control the gateway for apps to get through to consumers for every other company, ours included presumably, then they can exert monopolistic power over those apps. And there's a couple of reasons why Apple might want to do that, right? Because if you're in the business of selling expensive hardware like iPhones, you don't necessarily have an incentive to want apps that don't use the iPhone or use compute power that's bigger than what's available on the iPhone. So you think about cloud-based apps or AI-based apps or what they call super apps that use multiple apps within one and allow somebody else to be the gatekeeper there. All of that is something that Apple has an incentive to keep control over. But I think what we're looking at here, guys, is the very early stages now. We'll see the official announcement coming up shortly. And then the very early stages now of what will be a months and years long legal battle between Apple and the United States government.
Yeah, that was going to be my question. I mean, and you said it, years most likely, right? If history proves any guide here, given Microsoft and everything else.
Yeah, and one excerpt here, David, from the case that gives you a sense of the tone from the Department of Justice. They say, rather than respond to competitive threats by offering lower smartphone prices to consumers or better monetization for developers, Apple would meet competitive threats by imposing a series of shape-shifting rules and restrictions in its App Store guidelines and developer agreements that would allow Apple to extract higher fees, thwart innovation, offer a less secure or degraded user experience, and throttle competitive alternatives. So you get a sense of exactly what the DOJ is going after there.
All right, Eamon, stand by. Let's get over to Steve Kovac. He's got more on what it means for the company itself. With the stock down 2.5%, Steve.
Yeah, David, I actually got a statement here from Apple responding to the DOJ's lawsuit. I'll go ahead and read it out loud here for you. Quote, at Apple, we innovate every day to make technology people love, designing products that work seamlessly together, protect people's privacy and security, and create a magical experience for our users. This lawsuit threatens who we are and the principles that set Apple products apart in the fiercely competitive markets. If successful, it would hinder our ability to create the kind of technology people expect from Apple, where hardware, software, and services intersect. It would also set a dangerous precedent, empowering government to take a heavy hand in designing people's technology. We believe this lawsuit is wrong on the facts and the law, and we will vigorously defend it. And just some other interesting things here, David and Sarah, that stuck out to me. By the way, I'm looking at some excerpts from the DOJ lawsuit. I have not had a chance to dive through the full thing. But some interesting stuff on the super apps that Eamon was just mentioning. This lawsuit doesn't appear to go after the App Store directly as a whole. Instead, it's focusing on the super apps that Eamon was describing. We've seen this lawsuit between Epic Games and Apple kind of play out through the courts and basically kind of answered the question about Apple's App Store policies, the fees it charges, and so on and so forth, being the only exclusive way to download software to the iPhone. We've seen what happened with that in Europe, but that doesn't seem, at least right now, based on these excerpts I have, that doesn't seem to be what the DOJ is chasing. They're not proposing here saying, you know, there needs to be another kind of app store or anything like that. I would also point to the messaging thing. I know Eamon talked about this a little bit, but basically making the argument that by keeping iMessage sort of exclusive and degrading maybe the regular text message experience, that is anti-competitive. They use an example of what if you buy your kids an Android phone and you can't really talk to them as seamlessly as you could if you bought them an iPhone and things like that. And also the cloud streaming apps. This is another concession we've seen Apple make in the European Union, allowing services like Microsoft's Xbox cloud streaming service on those devices. So that could be one potential easy concession. Same with the payments. They made the same concession in the EU already, letting third-party apps access that New York Field communication chip for those tap-to-pay mobile payments, guys. So a little bit of difference between what the EU is attacking Apple for and what we're seeing here in this DOJ case. But, of course, we got to read through the whole thing, guys.
Although last week, I think when we talked to Margaret Vestager of the EU, she didn't rule out that they would be looking into a potential violation for Apple on the Digital Markets Act with some of the concessions they've made that might not go all the way, especially if they still continue to impose fees. I guess, Steve, the biggest question investors are going to have with the stock down 2.5% is what does it mean for the growth of the services business?
Yeah,
which has been a strong grower.
And that's why the App Store thing is so important here, because, again, I'm not seeing them really call out the App Store. You know, this is what's been pointed at so much. If you want to download an app to your iPhone, you only have one choice, and that's the Apple App Store. It doesn't seem like they're saying that here, which is the opposite of what we've seen in the EU, where Apple has to allow other app stores onto the phone. I don't see that here. I just see them talking about these super apps and these cloud streaming apps and messaging apps. So if they go in a more full way against the App Store the way the EU has, yeah, there's the services business. The App Store is massively lucrative for Apple, very high margin business, of course, largely due to the fees that they collect from the other developers. That's been the main complaint. So I can see, you know, the Spotifys and the Matches and other antagonists of Apple throughout this whole process. I can see them being less than happy with this lawsuit.
All right, Steve, stay close as we monitor the Justice Department there in the window next to you, waiting for the announcement.
The Fed holding rates steady and projecting 3 rate cuts still to come this year. Joining us right now on this is former Fed Vice Chairman Roger Ferguson. He's a former president and CEO of TIAA and now Vice Chairman of the Business Council and a CNBC contributor. Roger, when you and I spoke yesterday, you were thinking that they were more likely to move to the dot plots, at least, to signal 2 cuts for the year. Were you surprised that this maybe seemed a little more dovish than a lot of people had been anticipating?
I was surprised, but I also recognized that, in fact, you know, several did move in that direction. So I think this was a close call, and the market's getting very excited about, you know, something that's really, I think, a little bit on the margin. As I looked at yesterday, yeah, I will say there's a little bit of Chairman Powell's press conference when he was asked about the January and February numbers, where I thought he, you know, could have shown a bit more concern. So that might have been playing into the market as well, because many folks have been focused on those relatively hot numbers, and he put it in the context of, you know, a bumpy ride, and we'll look through it. Well, so I think there was a little bit of dovishness in there that perhaps might have been a bit unintended.
You know, the only thing I was trying to, I agree with you. That was kind of my take on it, too. He tried really hard not to say much of anything, I thought, through the press conference, because every reporter was trying to pin him down and get him to say something that we could read into the tea leaves and try and figure out when the cuts are going to start based on what he sees. The only thing I thought is maybe he doesn't want to sound like he's flip-flopping from what he said what was it, 2 weeks ago, to the Senate, where he said, you know, cuts will come sooner rather than later. He did sound the alarm that we are watching inflation very closely.
I think he certainly did. The other thing I noticed was that the statement itself, when it came to this question of, you know, needing to be convinced, went back to the usual language. So, in fact, the committee, to some degree, walked back the, you know, this is getting nearer than we might have thought. Back to what Chairman Powell had said during the Senate. So I think on balance, they tried to stay very close to, you know, the pre-existing line. I think the only place where I would have imagined they could have proved things forward a little bit is by maybe showing a touch more concern about inflation. The other thing that I found interesting was they marked up only slightly, but noticeably across the board, you know, where they think inflation is going to be this year. They marked up, again, slightly but noticeably, you know, growth expectations. So the overall message was the economy looks like it's a little stronger. Inflation may end up this year a little higher. And yet they didn't do what I thought, which is sort of be clear that they're ready to move 2, not 3, if that's what the data calls.
Roger, in your view, does the recession risk suddenly carry more weight with them for some reason than the inflation risk? Why are you thinking about cutting it all if you're not worried, if you're not seeing some crack somewhere? Do they know something we don't know about the risk to the economy? It just seems like that took a front seat and that inflation took a back seat all of a sudden. I don't know why.
Well, no, I think the reason that appears to be the case is that inflation has actually been coming down closer and closer to their target. And I think they are right to say when that is the case, the dual mandate comes into play. Having said that, I don't think that they are seeing a recession. I don't think the staff was forecasting one the way they were, you know, about a year ago or so. But the reason to talk about cutting, Joe, is obviously, rates are in restrictive territory. We don't know quite how much restriction there is. But if inflation does come down, then it's appropriate for rates to come down somewhat, because there's no reason to maintain an overly restrictive stance. So very data dependent, very dependent on the incoming data. And I would say the question of 2 versus 3 is not really resolved yet, because it's going to depend very much on the data.
It's just your one message that I want to make sure people hear, Roger, because I think you understand these things. You understand how Chairman Powell thinks. You understand how the Fed works as the former vice chairman. Your thought is that the market may be getting carried away and hearing things that you don't hear.
I think the market is hearing what it wants to hear. And yes, I think they're getting a bit ahead of where the Fed is. And I think the question of 2 versus 3 was a really close call. Had 1 or 2 moved slightly, we would have been talking today about how they moved to 2 from 3. And so it's really literally in every sense right on the margin. And so I do think that's the market once again getting maybe a little ahead of where the Fed is and hearing what it wants to hear and disregarding the rest, so to speak.
The Congressional Budget Office sounding the alarm. It is projecting that the U.S. debt will climb to 166% of the U.S. GDP by 2054. That would be up from 97% in 2023. It's also predicting that the Social Security pension fund will be depleted by the year 2033. Joining us right now to break down the highlights of that report.
Lowlights.
Or lowlights is Maya MacGuineas, Committee for Responsible Federal Budgets president. Maya, these are pretty staggering numbers. You want to lay it out in a little more detail?
Yeah, I mean, there's no good news to be found here, honestly. We know that the debt is on a steady march upward relative to the economy. The biggest drivers continue to be the aging of the population, healthcare. But I think most worrisome these days is that interest on the debt is really driving the growth at this point. And that's something the only way you can control is if we make the necessary changes of raising revenue and cutting spending. And though last year we did have one good step on that with the Fiscal Responsibility Act, that's not something you see Congress really willing to tackle in any meaningful way. So we are going to have spending growing over the 30 years that the CBO looks at in this document to record levels, 27% of GDP, much higher than it's been in the past. And our deficits and debt are all going to be reaching records. This slows economic growth. This weakens us from a foreign policy stand. It is not good for the health of the country. And it's the result of 2 political parties that are so busy beating each other up, they can't compromise and do any of the hard things we should be working on.
We had a conversation with Mohamed El-Erian just a few moments ago, talking about some of these issues and the warnings that have been out there for decades that somehow haven't really caught up to us yet. And I think that is what has made it easy for the 2 political parties to say, not our problem at the moment, not something we need to worry about. What everyone's warning is, I think they're painting you as a Cassandra for saying, okay, we don't need to listen to this just yet. What's your argument back to that?
Absolutely. It's very easy to dismiss this. Both the political parties do, but also you now have voters that aren't really concerned about the issue because it's very difficult to see how it connects to anybody's daily life. But here's what happened. Over the past decades, we had huge interventions from central banks. We had much more global flows, and we had changing in demographics that affected the economy that kept rates lower than people would have expected. The result of that, though, was people actually encouraged the government to borrow more. And borrow they did. And as we saw the past couple of years when inflation hit, which it still does as a result of many things, but part of that was fiscal stimulus. If inflation hits and interest rates have to go up, which they do, you suddenly have a very huge effect on your interest payments because the larger the debt is, the more sensitive we are to growing interest rates. And as we see those fluctuations, it's going to show the vulnerabilities that we have that are even worse because we waited so long to fix these problems. The other issue, of course, you mentioned, but Social Security and Medicare both have trust funds that are going insolvent in just about a decade. By waiting and doing nothing to fix those, we've left the people who depend on those programs incredibly vulnerable, and the changes are going to have to be much more difficult than they had to be if we'd gotten out ahead of this. So yeah, the political class is eager to find excuses not to do anything hard, but it doesn't mean it's good for the country. And in the end, the changes we have to make are going to be much more difficult. Probably the high levels of debt already are slowing the economic growth, which is really such an important factor looking forward, particularly as we have demographic headwinds, making that more challenging.
the revenue side is obviously really difficult to try to deal with. You don't know what helps when you try to raise revenue. You don't know if you're hurting growth, so that's a problem. But one thing that we probably could address more realistic is spending. But then again, we really can't. And I know you saw 2025, the spending, for the pandemic, we got up over $6 trillion for emergency spending. We're still doing $7 trillion for 2025 in spending. And if you don't pay for it, that adds on to the overall debt, which just is, once again, your interest expenses, adds on to what your interest expense. So it's like this vicious cycle. Where could we cut? Where could we cut spending in your view? Do we cut defense in this dangerous world? Do we cut, are there things, now every time I hear the Biden administration talk about spending, they say they're investing. I don't want them investing for me. I'll invest or let the private sector invest. Stop investing for me.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So spending is growing on a trajectory that is much, much faster than growth, much faster than revenues, and the short-term changes in the president's budget would have spending going to go a huge boost from very high levels. So the answer to your question is we have to look to cut spending almost everywhere. The biggest parts of our budget are healthcare and retirement programs. We have to look at those programs. I know everybody running for president promises not to touch Social Security. We have to fix the program. If we do nothing, there will be across the board 23% benefit cuts for everybody. So I'd look at slowing the growth of Social Security benefits. I would look at raising the retirement age for younger workers. Lots of things we can do on healthcare costs that would slow the growth there, looking at how the Medicare payments program is structured. You do have to do domestic discretionary cuts like we did in the Fiscal Responsibility Act, and those are going to have to hold. We've seen how hard it was to stick with them just for 1 year. We're going to have to prolong those over time. I used to think that there was a lot of savings in defense. I still think there's a lot of savings in defense, how we do procurement and other things. But I think, as you say, in this much more dangerous geopolitical environment, that's probably going to have to go back into other areas of defense. I leave that to the experts, but it's a riskier world, which is actually a reminder of why it was so dangerous to borrow for things we didn't need to borrow for, so that now when there's real pressures and real things to think about, cybersecurity, AI, all of these issues, it's much harder to find the room in the budget to have a budget that's nimble and responsive to the current environment. And by the way, we still have a social contract that is insuring for the risks of last century instead of the risks that current workers and families face today. So that's outdated, not making any changes there. Just one other point, we talk about revenues. All these long-term scary budget numbers assume the tax cuts will expire. And that's not going to happen. We know that there's going to be some amount of taxes that are extended. Both parties want that. So that will make the numbers even larger.